The Road to the New Era. Antonio.P. Copyright author, layout, and cover design. Antonio.P. Published in October 2013. Foreword. This is a book dedicated above all as the man, that is to try to express all the possibilities that the human being is capable of giving him. The worst enemy of mankind is within itself, i.e., excessive tendency of people to simplify everything in order not to have to engage in the awkward task of thinking about the world around them. This results in excessive trust that organizations like the political class or the various religious domes much more concerned about their own profit than helping people. It is therefore necessary, especially in this present age, people think about the world around them, because this is a time when increasingly what seems certain is false and what seems false is true, all because of how easily people take for granted the way the powers of society have the facts to them. With this book I will also try to show readers how wrong it is to believe religious books at face value, and for this I make an analysis of their history and the way in which they evolved until they reached us. Finally, I will expose those keys that in my opinion will be decisive for the progress of humanity. This book has been translated from the original Spanish version. Chapter 1, The Beginning. The Flying Object. In this chapter, I will explain when my concerns about scientific research began and why that research went beyond the classical, since I did not settle for the conclusions that were usually enough for people. That year, in August, I was vacationing with my family in a village called Cierzel, located north of Spain in the province of Leon, when an event that even seemingly simple occurred, however could be key in the future of my life in the future. At the time I was about 14 or 15, at approximately 1979. About 10 o'clock at night, after dinner, I and two of my cousins went for a walk and headed down the road that crosses the village towards the campaign where every year the festival is held in place. Then we were surprised by a fact which we found quite strange. It is that behind the house that was next to the campaign protruded a great luminosity. I went over to her by the side of the house and then I saw an intense white light that permeated everything, and it was hard to watch, but cannot remember exactly what produced it, so I told my cousins with signs from approaching me to see it. The next day, some residents of the town said they had seen the event and attributed it to the UFO phenomenon. Recently, in the summer of 2013, I again find myself in the same place with my cousin Mari Carmen, who witnessed the facts with me, and I told him that I could not remember exactly what I saw when looking at that light. She told me that only recalled an intense light receding into the sky. Also he told me, because I did not remember, that on the floor, where was light, had a large circle of scorched grass. Since we saw that object, my concern about these issues increased. The truth is that it was not just curious, because I felt the feeling of ease in finding solutions to scientific problems that they raised, as if the science flowed through my veins and out of me, so I came to ask if this would not be a case of the known abductions and made them our cosmic brothers who have taught me. For me it would be easy at this point to try and win the trust of readers saying such a thing, as they have done until today many writers of opportunism, but I prefer to stay with the truth, even if it means having me less support to my ideas. The truth is that since that day I always wondered if the sighting of the object had to do with my great interest in the search for truth and my feeling inspired about it, but I have to honestly say that there was never more meetings of this kind between these hypothetical aliens, and, as it was not indirectly or subconsciously, however, I have always believed that somehow they were guiding my footsteps in the distance, but not see or hear them in any case. In the hands of readers, let draw their own conclusions. From the age of 18 I decided to tell society about these experiences, but I had to wait 20 more years to be able to do so. I also felt a great interest in science books, especially astronomy books, because through them I imagined how it would be the future life in space, as well as giving me useful knowledge. It must be borne in mind that this is our future, and reading about it was a good mental gymnastics. I did not limit myself to the mere accumulation of knowledge as is done in schools. On the contrary, I used knowledge as a starting point to progress later through deductive meditation. In addition, I became fond of making a large number of plans on machines and spaceships, but not only on their external appearance but also on the internal technique and engineering. In fact, the true pleasure of research in philosophy is to apply the knowledge acquired to go further, and as if it were a form of clairvoyance trying to find the solution to the problems that afflict society. Because the true key to deducing the future is based on the inertia of nature to follow its path in the same way that a mass follows its own path when no force acts on it. Consequently, it can be affirmed that if a person takes the necessary time, takes scientific advice, and is lucky enough to have sufficient intelligence and intuition, they can manage to open a new frontier in knowledge. This is what the greats did, thinkers who were the prophets, but also the discoverers of the rest of the scientific branches. What is told in this and my other books does not pursue the profit motive as in the case of those false prophets who are many of the so-called paranormal writers, because I only try to open people's minds to the truth and that this world can finally be considered evolved. The disenchanted. When a person is fortunate that things will go well, usually trusting nature and think that everything that is told is true and that nothing bad can happen, believe what you hear on the news is true, that tell the powers of society it is true, and then that person becomes the perfect tool for those powers as well as being easy prey to criminals and scoundrels. But sometimes, due to setbacks in life, we brought heartbreak, and from that moment when our mind can begin to open up to the other side of the world, that is the true, and have a vision of things more critical, in which prime the search for the truth and not the easy acceptance of appearances, we will not trust easily in what they tell us, we will find in us a new person, able to start designing your own life and not let to manipulate us like a puppet. It is true that not everything is possible, but if you are aware that only after a fair and objective analysis can draw correct conclusions from things, then we will be happier and we will not be easy victims of manipulators. From the moment I saw that luminous object began asking questions about the world around me, conventional answers no longer seemed to me enough, and every time I felt more disappointed, it was like a short circuit in my mind had broken ties of those who manipulate society and lie to us every day. It's like suddenly the demons that inhabit the earth could no longer use the mask to hide his true face from us. It's not really see a diabolical face evil people, you could see through their appearance and discover the sinister being who was hiding inside. In this no one, not political or religious, because at that time he saw was the truth and not the bickering raged. We all want to be happy and that never end, but unfortunately that will only happen when the world is perfect. This is not an impossible achievement, but bear in mind that this is a world that has much to advance, but sooner or later hopefully reach a completion point in its development where peace is reached and welfare. But that will only happen when people stop being confident and start to build the world around them founded on peace and truth. Although it may seem curious, depression also has something positive, because in that state of prostration and relaxation, the concentration level increases and helps us discover the deceptions of the world that surrounds them. Arguably joy and sadness are like two polarities and is best placed in the average of them. However, when sometimes we get too close to one of the two also we can bring something different. Excessive optimism is also harmful, because we can bring down our guard and make mistakes. Do not confuse this with happiness. Well-being would be derived from things go well. Therefore, in this book, I try to open the minds of readers to finally dare to make the leap to the development of their own consciousness and begin to investigate the world around them and thereby contribute to world progress towards true directed thought. It should be noted that freedom of thought is to not accept the pressures of the powerful or those considered politically correct truth that in every age there, conditioned primarily by the postulates or less imposed by the victorious powers of war and by religious organizations. Because it's not the same religion that political power, for religion is generated mostly by men who have an idea and convey to the world, but religious organizations instead are forms of power competing with the world's governments in order to impose its principles. In fact, the world does not need such organizations, as philosophy or religion can be taught well in schools. It is for this reason, by which political power and religious are destined to collide, attempting these organizations compete on the same plane. They intuit deep anachronism in which they live and therefore become malignant and fundamentalists to retain power. This will lead them safely to their demise. The man of the future will no longer need temples, as the true temple is inside your heart. As regards politics, I think the current model could be defined as a system of false democracies, because true democracy is to get the people's government in all its aspects and not through a vote every 4 years as now. This political system that began with the English Civil War in 1642 alone was aimed at the abolition of the absolute monarchy and hand over power to the new force was the bourgeoisie, but for that they needed the people's participation as an alibi. However, after political parties were divided into two main political forces of left and right as a way to pretend a real alternation. The truth is that political activity has since been characterized by the systematic deception of the citizens by the various parties and thus get the vote with which the citizen gives alibi for politicians to have absolute power. Actually political dupe of these false democracies citizens with their false promises, but when they come to power, are dedicated to amass fortunes and easily forget their election promises, which is common in all of them. Citizens should refuse to participate in this mockery and demand the creation of a genuine democracy, requiring that the vote of each and every one of the laws, which could be done by simple systems such as the Internet. From that moment, the power would have it truly the people, but politicians exacerbate the aggressiveness of his followers against the other parties to block their minds and get your vote. That's the same strategy used by the Nazis in Germany to get the power. But really all politicians are alike, since most only seek power and money. Right-wing politicians manipulate information to remain in power indefinitely, because they think it is something that innately have the right to belong to what they believe a higher class. Left-wing politicians dupe people, saying that if they vote will care for them, but actually feel a profound contempt for the working class they will not try again, and while in power only try to get rich by any means be. As for nationalist politicians, most do not care the society they claim to represent and use the promotion of hatred against the state only as a means to power, without worrying about the consequences of their acts may cause. It should be borne in mind that this ideological divide is an artifice of politicians, as both left-wing ideas as right-wing have the same percentage of reason, some are right on some things and others are right in others. It can be understood that the politicians they divide into these groups in order to gain power, but cannot justify that citizens give up their own freedom of thought and give their power to the beast that is what represents this false political system. Faced with such deception, citizens should reject this political system by refusing to vote massively. This planned citizenship would notice these false democrats to propose once and for all a truly democratic system that condemns both the privileges and the monarchies and end this artificial and false democracy, and finally a political system where every law can be approved only if citizens the vote of a majority believed. People should ask why coexist in the same period dictatorships and democracies misnamed. The answer is very simple, and that are analogous political systems. In dictatorships totalitarian and restricted to a few power is exercised, however most citizens think it is a perfect system. The reason is simple, and it is that those with armies, bombs, and machine guns are those who govern, while they only have a simple job with which they are barely able to get ahead, so many prefer to think that all is well and condescend to the system. In communist countries people act alike, praise his chaotic system as the country sinks because communism strangles economic creativity. In democracies misnamed, politicians manipulate information so that citizens believe to be a fair system, but their only participation in power is a simple vote every 4 years. After election promises are usually broken, but that vote gives the rulers permission to do whatever they want to the end of the legislature without citizens can do nothing but wait for the next election, where political opposition will no doubt the same thing if they vote. People, you should realize that this game is nothing more than a form of mockery to society and not a true democracy. And if not, why none of those who call themselves Democrats proposes a switch to a system of direct election of each law? Because they feel comfortable using power for their interest and despising citizens. To maintain this political system assumes hand over power to those who do not seek anything other than prevent society from knowing the meaning of the word freedom. I'm not saying that citizens have to fight this beyond their means, because in many cases these chances are slim. But you can ask them to stop believing the lies that are told and stop collaborating with those who do not want the good of society. Need to understand that although the fear of power limits the judgment, the mind is free and you can escape their control, and those who live in democracies' bad calls should stop for a moment aside their arrogance and think that their political systems are so implausible as those of the mockers. because we must not confuse the level technological development with political, since they are two totally different things, and although these false democracies are preferable to dictatorships, not cease to be far from what they claim to be. Many of these false democracies presume to be fair political systems that respect human rights, but actually practice capitalism economy extremist, looking across to the thousands of poor who populate the streets. Ultimately, directed thinking is to pretend that citizens lose their freedom and their rights without being aware of it, manipulating information in order to delay the arrival of a genuine democracy and continue to keep in power who do not want, i.e., current political and religious. Chapter 2: The True Story of the Bible. Mesopotamia and Hebrew. About 12,000 years ago, the world was covered with ice in much of its surface. This caused a drop in sea level, making it possible to walk across from France to England by the English Channel, could also be passed from Asia to America through the Bering Strait. The last ice age was over and the ice was beginning to recede. The man in those semi-wild and primitive times spent most of his time to protect themselves from the elements in the caves. The climate in the area of Africa and Mesopotamia was nevertheless quite smooth. The gradual increase in temperatures was leading to an increase in population and the colonization of new lands. Man felt for the first time able to undertake projects and thus began the first experiments in the development of agriculture. This happened on 6000 BC, at the mouths of rivers in Egypt and Mesopotamia. With these first towns settled permanently around, the crops began to be required. Governments managed distribution of land and irrigation water, and thus began the first civilizations. At that time the Hebrews were nomadic tribes devoted mainly to grazing. Is in this way that this tribe would contact the Sumerian civilization settled in the mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates. The Hebrews were highly influenced by this culture. It could be said with certainty that much of the stories that gave us in the Bible about the origin of the world were inspired by this civilization. The story about the flood was probably copied from the legend of Gilgamesh and tells how an ancient king Sumerian saved from drowning climbing on a raft. Or the poem Atrahasis, written about 1600 BC, but surely inspired by an earlier legend. This also tells how he was saved from drowning in the flood, a pair of each animal species, probably inspired by her writer Bible telling the story of Noah and his ark. It is virtually identical to that which is narrated in it. Surely the origin of these stories of catastrophic floods is due to the fact that the first cities of Sumer where civilization Azur was forged were in the mouths of the aforementioned rivers and therefore vulnerable to flooding if heavy rainfall or flooding. The creation of man from clay, or the Garden of Eden, also has its version in Sumerian mythology. Another example of parallelism between the two cultures is the example of Marduk worship god. This is the chief god of the Babylonians, characterized especially by a prominent beard, curiously as defined as the Lord God in the Old Testament. Another example is the law of retaliation explained by Moses in the Old Testament. These legal or ideological norms were actually created by King Hammurabi of Mesopotamia, many centuries before they were written in the Old Testament. It is important to stress that taking religious books to the letter is a profoundly naive and unserious act. Suffice it to say that the Hebrews who gave us the Old Testament did not have an alphabet until about 8 centuries before Christ, when the original stay in Mesopotamia was not less than 500 years earlier. Therefore the Bible should be seen as a valuable book, but without losing sight of what it is, i.e. a book that unites old beliefs and superstitions with a prolific cultural message and philosophical post. So one could say that the first part of the Bible was written from the collection of stories passed down orally through the generations and therefore mainly based on beliefs rather than proven facts. After their period of stay in Sumeria, the Hebrews emigrated to Egypt, quite possibly because the increasingly warm weather was to desert large areas of the Middle East and North Africa. This was causing a large influx of population into the mouth of the Nile had been spared the spread of the desert. The Hebrews were mostly shepherds and therefore were the most affected by this climate change. This could occur about the year 1800 BC in Egypt, went on to become cheap labor, not necessarily slaves. Meanwhile pharaohs fomented worship him as being deified in order to maintain control of so many immigrants who were coming to their land. It was easier to maintain control by establishing a separation between rulers and ruled. This large influx of people out of work was also used for the construction of the pyramids, certain tasks that consumed the lives of many of them. Egypt monotheistic beliefs of Jews were reinforced by the fact that there is also almost exclusively worshipped the god Ammon, later drifted into Akhenaten was processed. Another belief that surely the Hebrews acquired from the Egyptians was the idea of the existence of life after death, but through the resurrection of the body after death, the Egyptians cared much these details and to bury their pharaohs them around your jewelry and valuables to the resurrection of the body in the afterlife. They could use them for this reason to link the past with his own body. The Egyptians were obsessed in protecting hiding corpses embalmed in complex caves or in the pyramids. But a casualty could be the cause of the exodus of the Jews to Palestine, and the earthquake and volcanic eruption on the island Thera or Santorini in the Mediterranean also destroyed the Minoan civilization, could cause serious damage to agriculture. Egyptian. The Exodus. North of Egypt in the Mediterranean, flourished one of the most advanced civilizations of the time. The Minoan civilization on the island of Crete was situated in a privileged point for trade between Europe and Africa. Near her island was Thera, or a volcanic island Santorini small. About 1600 BC, there was in it a strong earthquake followed by a volcanic eruption. The first result was the destruction of the Minoan civilization buried under tons of ashes. Those who managed to escape surely made to Greece and Egypt. This could contribute to the flowering of Mycenaean civilization in Greece. This could also be the cause of the origin of the legend of Atlantis, although it is difficult to know for sure. What seems clear is that the stories told in the Bible about how before leaving Egypt events occurred, suggests that catastrophic events as well as diseases of the population may well have been caused by the consequences of the eruption the island of Thera. It is also possible that after the earthquake, a tidal wave that reached the coast of Egypt, may be the origin of the biblical story of the separation of the Red Sea and the subsequent drowning of the Egyptian army occurred. Actually, the Bible was not written until several centuries after the Exodus, and therefore it is quite logical to think that what we are told it is more than accurate historical facts, the remains of a story having been orally and not transmitted in writing. While it may have been losing the original accuracy, it is converted more mythical stories on historical facts accurate. That is why those who cling to the belief of taking the Bible literally commit a grave error, because first of all implies a waiver of its own judgment, in addition to being carried away by those who only seek to benefit from the Bible, illegally favoring the myth over reality and especially trying to prevent the trial of people to show them that should not question the facts as they are told. Besides, what evidence have to say that God would not allow the modification of biblical facts after having been written in order to test the common sense of men? We must seek the truth for oneself with an objective judgment without being manipulated. Later, during his stay in Babylon, the Jews also could be influenced by other religions. Zoroastrianism, where he also believed in the existence of higher beings or angels. However, it is impossible to say that was the cause of the biblical stories about, because if true, the existence of such superior beings also may have influenced other religions, as in Hebrew. As for the story of Moses and the possible involvement of a Hebrew in the Egyptian monarchy, it is possible that its origin is because just coinciding with the time of his arrival in Egypt, another Semitic tribe from eastern Hyksos conquered the country 1730 BC and remained in power until 1580 BC, where they were defeated. So if we relate the proven historical facts with biblical stories, we could do a reconstruction of events, so it can be assumed that the Hebrews could reach Egypt with the Hyksos or shortly after they, and the story of Moses indicate that somehow they felt identified with this people. When the Bible speaks of a Hebrew in the Egyptian monarchy, possibly they are referring to a Hyksos king. The Hebrews and Hyksos were certainly different peoples but would have more historical ties with each other than with the Egyptians, hence identify with them. Just at that moment of splendor in the domination of the Hyksos in Egypt was another key event in the biblical story, and was the earthquake and subsequent volcanic eruption on the island of Thera in the Mediterranean. This happened only about 20 or 30 years before the expulsion of the Hyksos, so it can be assumed that the two events may be related. Such an event and subsequent ashfall caused a major upheaval in the country's crops, causing disease and hunger among its inhabitants as described in the Bible. This would cause the weakening of the state, leading to his downfall. Climatological disaster and war that led to the ouster of the Hyksos could be the causes that gave rise to the biblical Exodus, circa 1580 BC. Possibly after leaving Egypt, the Jewish people returned for several centuries nomadism, settling gradually form in the territories of today's Israel, so it took some time to be able to define as a true nation, but surely their religion much to it. Therefore one could say that the story today of those events have more than a mere invention seems the result of the limited information that was when the Bible was written, several centuries later. Do they mean these conclusions what we are told in the Bible is not true? Not necessarily because those who wrote thought about it, just the information they had was inexact, but not false, especially the farther the past is concerned. It is not the same who modifies a story deliberately misleading whoever simply enter a story that only incomplete data have beliefs. As for the possibility of intervention by higher entities or extraterrestrial beings as guides of the Jewish people, it does not seem objectionable necessarily, because in my opinion, the world still holds many mysteries to unravel, and the possibility that an extraterrestrial civilization would come to land in the course of our history is not in any case nonsense. The truth is that this hypothesis can explain why the stories narrated continuously in the Bible about meetings between superior beings and the prophets. If there is an extraterrestrial civilization on our planet, you might well consider that this small town could be the ideal to instill in our world a superior culture that had hitherto existed. Aliens sign an agreement consistent with that they would provide land protection and Jews in return should fulfill its precepts. The Hebrews had an order of values quite advanced for its time, because this could attempt to establish communication between the two cultures and thus promote the progress of all mankind. Successes and failures of religions. Actually, all monotheistic religions' type is that they believe in one God have at heart a great similarity, because although differently tend to converge in the same direction. For example, the Buddhist belief in reincarnation has resemblance to the Christian resurrection of the dead, and in all religions is commonly spoken good as the way to overcome the problems towards an ideal world. It should be stressed that different religions constitute a form of cultural wealth and good for all mankind, for religion is also a part of science, although it may be a long way to be truly perfect. Therefore they should be considered something that gives us training or perspective on things, but without denying that as all science is in a process of development and therefore subject to successes and mistakes. Clearly taking the Bible literally is a mistake, so we must always be willing to revise it. Buddhism. In my opinion, the religion that better life after death arises is Buddhism or Hinduism, because in them quite acceptable explanation of how life can be in the hereafter is given, and is the belief in reincarnation. This belief is that the true spirit depository of life is eternal, and goes through life through reincarnation, first in the various animal forms and then evolve to the human form. However, I do not consider correct the widespread belief among them that after reaching a spirit reincarnated in human form can return to animal form, according to which they are moral acts in this life. The explanation is very simple, and that is the fact that our behavior, more or less successful, will not have to relate to return to an animal form, as errors committed in the human form is in this form which must be corrected, and there is no need to relate one thing with another. Another behavior that I consider completely reprehensible, is the custom among the lamas of Tibet to choose their positions among children in a targeted manner, claiming that these children are the reincarnation of the ancient religious leaders, because even if some such thing, that has why assume any advantage over the other candidates for the post, and if they really have some virtue that allows them to stand out from the rest, to prove in a peaceful and democratic competition for such a position of power. I think in this case what is sought is really condition the course of these future leaders controlling them since childhood, because the merits they may have achieved in the past is not a reason to question the merits or rights of others. The Islam. Just as the Christian religion was influenced by the Bible beliefs of Mesopotamia and Egypt, Muhammad was inspired by Christianity to shape Islam, because it is almost entirely derived from it, except for some possibly customs Arab origin were added. Islam was right to encourage the development of a monotheistic religion and written, because previously there were only a variety of very primitive beliefs. Islam is a wise move reject the worship of saints who does the Catholic Church, because it is a form of disguised polytheism. It is a success of Islam recognize that man must lead the marriage, because the experiments being carried out in the West with feminism cause couples to be ungovernable, to be a permanent rivalry between spouses. Also birth is impaired to distract the women of this function to deal with typically male tasks. This is not to deny women the right to work outside the home, but that's not a reason to forget about the importance of having children in their timely manner, as in the West has become a widespread practice to have children very late age for women be a priority for the practice of a race that resembles the man. It is not fair that a woman has children at 40 years old and born as locking them in a nursery. Each sex must assume that it is different and with different functions. Of course, this does not mean you have to consider women as an object of man, for the duty of this is to be president of the non-dictator family. Men and women must be equal in the right to be happy, but that it does not mean you have to be the same way. It was also a great success of Islam emphasize the rejection of alcohol, because it is just a drug that hinders man's understanding of what health and pleasure, because it is with a clear mind and free from the influence of drugs as they obtained. Instead, it was a mistake to Islam worship a stone, which is what is done in Mecca, since it is a form of polytheism. Muslims say it is only a historical relic, but if that were true, should prove removing it from the place of worship where it is and bringing it to a museum. It is also an error. Ramadan, it is not the same. Ask people who are moderate with food, which require them to be a month without eating or drinking all day. It is also a mistake to require women to the face or head clogged with a veil, as it is in love and mutual trust which must be placed the relationship in a partner and not impositions based on fear and insecurity. In any case, we must understand that in those times when the Quran was written, women already using this garment in order to protect themselves from the sun or sandstorms and is for the purpose for which it was justified, but impose it on today unnecessarily is entirely wrong. I also consider a mistake defense of polygamy, because I believe every man is entitled to a woman and it is better this way as each spouse's rights are guaranteed. Another mistake was not to show Islam opposite to slavery, even if it was a common custom in those days, but once consolidated religion would have been easy to propose. The Judaism. I believe that the Jews as a people are admirable in many ways, as they have a great sense of shame and always try not to depend on anyone and progress as possible in their professional duties, also easily inclined to accept new ideas. However, their fundamentalist groups leave much to be desired. Although this is also prevalent in other religions, these groups try to convince citizens that represent better than other God, but their behavior is self-destructive in the service of power. Sex totalitarian. Another practice entirely reprehensible among Jews is circumcision, because first of all represents an assault on the physical integrity of children while they are minors. Any amputation of the sexual organs of both boys and girls is a cruel practice that should be forcefully rejected by all countries and by the Organization of the United Nations to achieve a total ban in the world. Chapter 3, Jesus and the Prophets. The life of Jesus. I find it regrettable to see how even today people are unable to learn to understand the true nature of Jesus, for he was a man like others, but endowed with the gift of seeing and understanding what others were not capable. This of course not make him a divine being like the Church would have us believe, but an exceptional man. The truth is that after his death at the hands of the Romans, the apostles thought that if they did not have people a magical story of his life, Jesus' sacrifice would be in vain, for it invented in agreement fantasies about his birth, a virgin, the Star of Bethlehem, or the miracles, all completely false. Unfortunately, people often react with indifference when told of the spiritual or soul salvation truths, however react like a spring when they are talking about miracles. This does not mean that the message of Jesus should be thus despised, because the truly divine in his life is his message, not his person, and all attempts made later to divinize him, his mother, or the apostles, were but an aberrant form of polytheism in order to elevate a foolish and vindictive prophet's life this way. I do not mean to blame the apostles of it, for inventing these stories is what they tried to get the message of Jesus transcended into a world full of superstitions, was unwilling to accept a Messiah who would not do miracles. Instead, itself is responsible for the Church, because once he got the message of Jesus was known in all the earth, was due to oppose any form of worship of his person from his mother or the apostles, for the truly divine is the Jesus message. Because it is not important who conveys a message or teaching, how important is the teaching itself. Christ was the last link in the transmission of a culture that had many centuries of evolution and so is justified. Only listen. Nor is it correct to say that Jesus was a Jew. It is like saying he had nothing new to contribute to their religion and Jesus above all was a prophet, that is an innovative philosopher willing to denounce the failures where saw. That was the reason that religious leaders asked her death. There are also those who want to see in Jesus a political rather than a religious character like a king, rambled on what would that have had children. Such a thing is absurd as to have had that would not imply any territorial right for them, their enthusiasm it was to conquer territories' consciences. Jesus could be a prophet or a philosopher but not a politician, so said his kingdom was not of this world. After the Catholic Church was finished becoming an extension of the Roman Empire, for being declared official state religion which was attempted without success is that it does not disappear. But the Church inherited the worst of him to use religion as a mere instrument of global power. To do this, the worship of religious characters into divine par with God being cultivated, worship the Virgin for example, was a true revival of the worship of female gods as in the case of Hera or Athena in ancient Greece. Consider that God is not necessarily male or female, it is an abstract concept and possible sexual duality would be sought only in the definition of God himself and not in others. For example, arguably the female part of God would be the justice also represents him. It was also this deification with the Pope, whom he declared infallible, that besides being a blasphemy was an act entirely reprehensible, as this was to use the religious argument to get people and possibly the world's governments they are undergo their interests and create a world dictatorship. Denied citizens the right to think freely and demanded absolute submission interposing between God and men, claiming that it was God's will that they should say. In addition, they prevented freedom of thought and tried to prohibit the dissemination of the Bible after the invention of printing to maintain a monopoly over it. But the most absurd of all is to be constituted as an independent state in order to start global domination, creating a religious dictatorship, which is why the Church should be rejected, because religion must be in society but through books and schools and not by the existence of forms of private power, seeking to compete with the state. The man of the future will no longer need churches and rituals to feel united to God, because what unites man with God is the awareness of self and their search for truth and freedom. The idea of the resurrection. The true meaning of the resurrection is that in the cosmos all lives are eternal in nature, because the body is weak but the spirit is strong and eternal, hence the idea of resurrection for the final judgment. The body dies, but the spirit remains for subsequent reincarnation in a new body for a new life. The other cheek. We have talked a lot about whether Jesus intended his followers not to defend themselves from being attacked. That belief is absurd, because survival is not possible without a clear right to self-defense. What happens is that when necessary confront a force vastly superior as were the Romans, Jesus proposed turning the other cheek as a way to imply that not willing to fall into provocation and that their struggle had to go to merely prophetic. Water life. The water of life to which Jesus referred in the New Testament is arguably the pleasure felt with the search for truth through philosophy. This feeling is not unique to the philosophers, it is the same feeling you feel when the solution after a scientific investigation is. This feeling is the consequence of reaching the truth and see the light before the darkness of ignorance, is an authentic way to see God, because truth is God. Many fortunes were spent touring the world saying it's because they want to know, but it's unfortunate that often end their lives without discovering how important is the inner journey, i.e. the journey through knowledge and science to find indeed, as this is also a wonderful way to see the world. Gods and men. One of the biblical myths is the idea that the heroes of antiquity were descendants of the union between gods and men. The truth is that this is a story that is most of the time have some truth and a lie, because most mythological stories from near a psychological approach to things, i.e. when the life of a man transcends than usual and becomes a hero or makes a discovery that gives notoriety and that is a progress for the rest of the world, arguably then given him a merger for which he is man. Because physically he is like the others, but it seems divine because it is transmitting or carrying those ideas or discoveries that are the correct definition of God. The Crusades. After making calls by Muslim holy lands during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church tried to reconquer the territories, calling for men and resources with which to achieve this end. In my view, the reconquest was a mistake, because the only truly holy is the message of Jesus and not the lands which also were walking kings and powerful who participated in such expeditions actually made for profit and obtain land and not for religious purposes, but looked like a pirate expedition than anything else, even came to plunder Constantinople when he was still Christian, contributing to his fall into the hands of Muslims. Actually, this was one of many attempts by the Catholic Church to emulate the political power of the Roman Empire conquered lands. For more than holy places, there are holy ideas. Holy it is the message of Jesus and not people or things related to it. Often throughout history it has used the appeal to patriotism as a way to get soldiers for wars, but often those who benefit from them are the powerful that instigate and not the soldiers fighting them. Sometimes wars simply serve for governments to be removed from among unemployed citizens, after an economic crisis. The truth of Fatima. In my view, the truth about what those children saw in the so-called miracle of Fatima was not the image of the Virgin as the Church tells us, because the description they gave rather suggests that it was a being superior of probably extraterrestrial origin. And the true meaning of the third message, which announced to the world, is the impending disappearance of the Catholic Church, since it has become the seat of the devil and not the house of God, by departing from the purpose for which it was created. Heaven and Hell. Those considered loyal supporters of official science, they say mockingly that religions are useless because they are full of superstitions and misconceptions. This is partly true, but should be a little more humble and realize that many of beliefs considered now as immutable in a few years will be considered as own nonsense of a backward society. This is because many of the things that we believe are not sufficiently demonstrated, and our order of values is only partly based on truth. And if those who consider themselves scientific materialists could travel to the future and looking back would be ashamed to see that many of his ideas supposedly in line with science are wrong. Therefore, when analyzing the beliefs of the past, right thing to understand is that those who created not found a better way to tell what they thought and maybe what they felt was true, but the problem was finding a way to tell the most accurate way. Arguably the correct definition of heaven, where one goes after death, would actually be the world once finished its process of evolution and reach a high level of peace and happiness. In the different religions arises this as the reward for a righteous life. Actually all people reach that perfect world through individual overcome their own mistakes, which in turn will lead to the evolution of the world. All this came to but not through the resurrection of the body, which has meaning only through a new reincarnation. In the past this truth was not understood. This explains the excessive value was given to the preservation of the bodies after death. As for hell, arguably is the state of suffering that you get to follow a wrong path and therefore can leave it once they return to the right direction. Consequently, the idea of hell as a place that you go to is always naive. As long as there is life in the spirit, this may change. The idea of irreversible punishment can only be understood as applicable to this life to the next. At the end of all beings find their way and will reach the final destination in heaven. As regards the devil, arguably it has no real physical existence, it is an abstract way of defining the error when it is directed toward evil. Actually the devil can only acquire human form when a person assumes evil as a form of behavior, but not because an evil spirit has possessed him, but because by choosing that option represents, i.e. a devil is a being who has turned evil, but stops being then also rendered an expression devil. As for the correct definition of the fallen angel, this would be in the past evil existed in many worlds in space, but according to those worlds from which the angels have eradicated and only stay in the primitive worlds like Earth. As for demonic possessions, must say that if true, not treat possession of the body by a demon as normally understood, but rather a spirit of a deceased person would try to come back to life, so wrong that is robbing the body to another. However, it is difficult to say when these alleged possessions are not part of a ritual in which the hypothetical victim can participate under the influence of drugs or hypnosis and collaborate in a subconscious way represent such possessions. Therefore, in this case it would not be correct to speak of the existence of demons but beings or spirits who at one point to personify such behavior. Sometimes when a person dies without believing in the afterlife, tends to try to return to the world that left remaining in the buildings he knew or where he died, these spirits do not realize that to return have to move forward and prepare for a new life and a new reincarnation. In other cases, a spirit simply not continue their way because they either do not understand who has died or has been dealt a traumatic death and believes that this spirit has left pending tasks that prevent you from continuing on to the afterlife. There are also places that appear to be conducive to the manifestation of spiritual entities, it is as if they were open to facilitate communication between the two dimensions and is relatively easy for an ordinary person to see ghosts called, could be caused by geological reasons or stream static electricity that amplify the spiritual dimension. The fact is that today is a subject little clarified. The Antichrist. What is the Antichrist? You could say it's all ideology that opposes Christ, i.e. the pursuit of the good that his philosophy represents. Antichrist is the materialistic ideology which denies citizens unemployed minimal survival benefit. Antichrist is when a father sees factly that their children get drunk and lead a promiscuous life. Antichrist is the one who mocks his race and culture inherited from their ancestors, allowing the abomination of miscegenation. Antichrist who is justice and respect for others as the essential standard of living does not arise. Is Antichrist who denies life after death and eternal existence of the spirit. Antichrist is the one who worships other gods considering men as with the saints or virgins, for they are men and that is a polytheistic practice and a mockery of God. Antichrist is the one who uses the vile and uneducated as a rule expression language. Antichrist is the one whose slavery arises as a form of work. Antichrist is the one who accepts drug use as something natural, including in them alcohol or snuff, as disturb the mind away man from a sensible view of things. Antichrist is the one who does not consider the moral as fundamental in teaching children. Antichrist is the one who calls him love sex. Love can have sex, but also can have sex without love. Antichrist is feminism, then confuses respect for the rights of women with the rivalry with the man encouraging them to compete for the same functions. This has led to an excessive drop in birth rates in countries where it is implanted in addition to making marriage ungovernable. Do not understand that men and women have to be complementary, but without competing with each other, and without this being considered by one as superior to another. Antichrist is the one who seeks to deny the right to think or disagree, saying that what he says is the absolute truth. This is what many religions and sects to turn man into a mere instrument of other men. It's not the same religion apparatus religious. Religion is an ideology, religious apparatus is a mechanism that seeks power trying to replace governments and therefore must disappear. There is no greater vileness that use religion as a cover to shelter evil, claim that they represent God, they are infallible and cannot be wrong. It is blasphemous and therefore have become the seat of Satan. Because there is no better hostel for the devil that we're not expect, i.e. in the ruling domes of religious organizations and sects, so it is in schools where they should teach moral principles and not elsewhere. Antichrist is homosexuality, because who has that behavior mocks nature, away from it rather than seek ways to recover the way. This is not to deny freedom of choice but to reject that option and not cooperating with her. Antichrist is vanity, how widespread is the earth and makes people believe that is beyond their means, bringing them into error. Antichrist is the one who insults God, because there are people who believe in the right to judge him, as if they knew better than he what is true or false. These people are Satan who listens and is evil all there in his soul. People have to realize that this is the time when most difference between what seems true and what is true. Deceivers of the earth know that they have little time, and that man will end up realizing that the truth must be sought and not expected to serve it without any effort on your part. When man understands that freedom begins to start to doubt what you say and do not take anything for granted, you will have begun to these scammers and the beginning of a new era. False prophets. Who are these false prophets of the Bible that tells us? False prophets are religious organizations and sects that stand between man and God. They try to monopolize what is true and what is not, seek to impose their will on the democratic decision of the citizens, knowing being unfair, intended to state that what they say is God's church just because they are called. But the truth is not what it seems but what is not the cardinal suit makes a righteous man but his will. These organizations know that they have little time, for when man understands that you do not need to communicate with God they will disappear, because no one has the right to proclaim God's representative, since it is blasphemy to be compared with him, and the Pope of Catholic Church did when he proclaimed himself infallible. The truth is that in the future such organizations no longer necessary, because religious teachings will be in schools and the organizations that serve the supposed representation of God to get power illegally will have to disappear, because there is much difference between appearance and reality. and many try to benefit from this difference at the expense of citizens. Man does not need intermediaries to communicate with God because God is truth and light and it can be reached by oneself. It does not have to be anyone seeking to consider the alleged exclusive representation of God. It is necessary to protect especially those organizations who claim to be more religious than others but hide the evil in their midst, such as Islamic fundamentalists, who want to hand over political power to religious to create a dictatorship led by them. Also Jehovah's Witnesses, the Amish, or extremist Jews. These organizations are run by domes formed by a small number of people who dictatorially intended to condition the lives of their followers. They do not care to do good, only interested in exercising power while maintaining backward customs and denying his followers right freedom of thought or action. Are also false prophets many of the writers of the paranormal or spiritualism, because they pretend to be in contact with higher entities or aliens without being true, cause thereby discrediting those who tell the truth. They do not have the courage to defend their ideas openly, leaving the reader to think and why they lie about the alleged contact. But those false contacted are easy to recognize because they only know how to say the words love, brotherhood, fraternity, and love, fill books with. Many words actually they mean nothing, because never condemn the evils of the earth, never bring out the corrupt and those who seek to do evil in this world, because their real interest is the role and economic profit. There are those who use the opposite tactic, showing the aliens as demonic beings allied with the governments of the earth. With this method cheat who also not willing to accept the existence of superior to them beings and only accept if presented as beings vulgar and evil. They do not realize that it is his vanity and his own ego that makes them think so. When they think of them that way, it actually remember it is your own reflection in the mirror. Do not understand that if aliens had wanted to invade land they had done thousands of years ago when the world was still very backward. I think something more can be expected of evolution. There are those who deny the existence of aliens, saying that in such a case would have already openly declared to us. But why not do it as simple and do not consider the inhabitants of this world as valid interlocutors to talk with also them? Is that the land is still undergoing a major process of evolution and its many prejudices prevent contact between equals. Therefore it is prudent to wait for this world completes its evolution, intervening meanwhile indirectly. There keep in mind that the values that govern today is mere interest for power and money. However, the evolved societies consider first the dignity and ethics. Some also claims that exist aliens governments of the earth and would have confirmed, but the real reason not to do is the simple shame, because it is quite embarrassing to recognize that these unidentified flying objects fly over everyday heaven of our planet without anyone being able to stop them. Another feature of these false prophets is to try to scare people arguing the end of the world, with the intention that they do not realize that the real danger they have ahead, and it is those charlatans who are scared to take away the money. Common feature is that they put dates to the supposed end of the world. To my mind there will be no such end but a transformation of humanity that becomes a developed society. Arguably evil philosophy is that you can find arguments to defend any theory however absurd it may be. This life quacks who cheat to get money, they use half-truths to cause confusion, so those seeking really have to act as if within themselves have two people predisposed to believe and another skeptic, is in this debate as is the truth. I would also like to mention here so many writers of classical literature who feign a false humility in order to get rewards and recognition they do not deserve, as is generally characterized by a superficial literature. The first churches. At first, the temples were used as places of worship to idols and people came to them to do or leave offerings to its many imaginary gods. The temple therefore to the role of alleged house of their god represented by a series of dolls which they stood in a prominent place of it and people could visit as if it were a neighbor over town. Subsequently, the temple's addition to being used for the worship of idols began to be used for recitation of religious books. The Catholic Church for example replaced idols by Christs, virgins, and saints. Really are idols exactly like the previous, because the true definition of monotheism is that there is only one God and God alone is to be worshipped. This means that the installation of dolls in churches, whatever they are, is a clear throwback to the past, and the reason it is the obsessive desire for the church not to lose their power. Because an evolved society does not need temples, as the true temple of God is the heart of the righteous, because God has no home because it is everywhere. An evolved society does not need temples, because the teaching of religion is in schools or academies established for this where you have to teach. Religion must merge with society and taught with other subjects and not be a hostage of religious organizations who only seek power for themselves, because it is not the same religious organization. Religion is a way of thinking and a philosophy. Religious organization is a company that intends to use religion to gain power and money. They also try to make us believe that temples are necessary for performing rituals like baptism or communion, scare people by saying that if they do not their children will be condemned to hell, but such a thing is absurd, because baptism is no more an unnecessary at present mere ritual, and in any case do not make sense to minors, but is done in order to impose submission to their religion before they can remember. The truth is that rituals are not necessary, but religious organizations try to use them in order to force citizens to go to the temples and thus exert power over them. With the disappearance of the temples also disappear these organizations, and finally the man will be free to communicate with God without intermediaries seeking to tell what the divine will. The nature of a prophet. What qualities and circumstances make a philosopher or a prophet differ from most people? In my opinion is the sum of different factors. The first is arguably the opportunity, because in order to develop a complex form of philosophical idea or a scientific theory is necessary to have time to make possible a rigorous and thorough analysis that allows to achieve a minimally drawn conclusions. That is, a philosopher you need to distance himself enough from the usual life events so that you are able to concentrate on their work, because philosophy, unlike other sciences, requires a certain loneliness to be developed, and actually achieve this is not so simple. So it's a little science evolved. This is not to say that in order to develop a philosophical idea is essential to distance themselves from other people, or that it prevents you from having a family. I just want to say that the depth and efficiency of reflection is proportional to the concentration to be taken when is analyzed. But it is not good absolute solitude, for some alternation in daily tasks helps meditation. Anyway, you can always find a place for everything throughout life. The second factor is luck, because without a little chance it would be difficult for a man to gather all necessary to achieve results in a complex such as philosophy. A man can have great talent, science, circumstances, but in order to survive has to be occupied much of their time on other tasks. You cannot engage in this function. The third factor is intelligence, since without intelligence nothing would serve the above factors, for the philosopher, though it be called so, would not achieve any results in their investigations if it lacks it, and in my opinion, many more writers untalented than those who have it and do not always work who deserves recognized. In fact, intelligence is what drives the philosopher to begin their research and helps you discover the keys of scientific progress. The fourth factor is intuition. This quality is what gives rise to clairvoyance, i.e. the ability to have a deductive thinking beyond normal. This requires unite intimacy, intelligence, and honesty, because without this last quality the findings of a philosopher would upset and would be deformed and wrong, because honesty can assess the circumstances in perspective. In any case, only when that state of prostration and distance is acquired it is possible to achieve the necessary sensitivity to transcend time and place and see things with perspective enough to be a true innovator with the rest of the citizens. Due to the special demands that philosophy has to be able to develop, such as concentration or intimacy, it is the least evolved science of all today, and this is the most need to advance in the coming centuries. Divine inspiration. Many people wonder, what's that called divine inspiration, and is commonly attributed to the great pioneers of religions like Buddha, Christ, or Mohammed, comes from higher entities or aliens. So while it may be true, does not have to be necessarily so, because a man can find the truth through its own search. You can find inspiration for their own efforts. It is as if through storm clouds saw the clear light that shows the way, and to achieve do not need more than their own efforts, because at the end of the correct definition of God is the light of truth, and who discovers the truth discovers God. One can reach it by itself or through the help of others, but does not have to be necessarily so. So when we speak of divine beings, the right thing is being with divine ideas, because a man is limited. The divine, it is the truth it conveys. The nature of the spirit. Another common question is why, if we have a spirit that has eternal life, we cannot remember anything about him or our past lives. The answer is simple, because just as when we went to bed we spent all night dreaming and yet we can hardly remember anything of what we have dreamed, for so does the spirit. The truth is that there are different forms of memory in dreams. Do not remember that they are only dreams or what we did before, and when we wake up in the morning not remember what we dream in most cases, because memory works in different frequencies and each of these memories only works within its own plane. In a way it is as if we'll deactivate to change the plane, but perhaps the most correct answer is that memories of each memory is recorded at different frequencies, so that only if the mind is in the corresponding frequency it is able to remember. Arguably the frequency of the different memories: far infrared conscious memory when we are awake, ultraviolet memory when we are spiritually. The purpose of the existence of different types of memory is not interfering at different levels, thus when we reincarnate to not remember anything past lives, these memories do not interfere and allow us to live this life in a way more intense, as if it were the only one. Anyway, sometimes, when we are in a more sensitive mental state, it is possible to remember something saved in the spirit memory, but surely we blame they are dreams or memories of something that has happened to us in this life. In any case, it is a mistake to think that any memory is useful because our brains are recording and erasing the continuously. It is not useful to remember everything, remember only those things that are worthwhile. Some believe that there is life after death, but I should think that when a soldier has to go to war and fight, giving him strength is not thinking of his country, nor in the salary paid, which gives him the strength to think that not all end up there after his death and afterlife begin. What unites man with God? What is it that unites man with God? This question leads becoming humanity from the beginning of time. What unites man with God is to discover their own capacity to design the world in their own way. This does not mean you can get everything that is proposed, but rather that it should have the willpower to achieve what question to get. The key to this is to develop the ability to disagree, i.e. maintain the determination to be free mentally, not to allow the wishes and opinions of others are regarded as immutable truth, much as representatives of God proclaim themselves, cited or contacted. One of the qualities that make a man a truly evolved being, and unlike a world that has already completed its evolution from another, is that man evolved does not draw conclusions hastily, does not consider anything true without a thorough analysis of the facts and judge things impartially regardless of ideological fashions of each era. To be considered an evolved, it is necessary that freedom of thought is one of its core values. It is important to note in this regard that man evolved does not fold to any book very sacred that this be considered, since only before the truth must be folded, and is not that a book cannot contain great ideas or great values, but also it may contain large errors, and evolved man must analyze things with a fair trial, seeking truth in them without setting prior prejudices. Moreover, even if a book was inspired by superior beings, it cannot be ruled out that this book has been modified later or that these beings have allowed the limited modification of his teachings in order to test the ability of judgment the men. Also keep in mind that a primitive society may not accept the message of these beings in pure form, not understand it, and necessarily merge it with the primitive beliefs of the people who were to receive these teachings. That is, it should be understood that message as a guide to improve existing human beliefs, but without having to necessarily represent the truth of an accurate and unquestionable manner. Therefore, it is necessary to respect the skeptics when they act honestly, because the engine of intellectual progress is the ability to disagree. Without respect for the opinions of others it is impossible to discover their own failures. It is also true that some people reject an idea without real reasons for fear of shame, not being in keeping with the fashion of his time, and this is itself unfortunate. The true meaning of God. The true definition of God is that God is light and truth. You can also define God as the set of laws that govern the universe. Therefore the definition of God as a bearded being and moody located on a cloud, it is not more than the abstract form of definition itself of a primitive society. It is therefore wrong to see God as a kind of person you may be asked things we want or blame him for everything that happens, because God is only the coordinator of the cosmos element in which all living beings including partake and we influence their destiny. Actually we are all part of God, because we have an eternal soul that allows us to participate in the configuration of the universe, so the man has to realize that it is through a critical attitude of the world around us as it communicates with God and it helps you determine your destiny difficult than others seek to dictate something. The universe has a cyclical nature by which everything is recycled, everything is repeated and everything is regenerated, so that in the course of eternal life we will all live both the good possible events as bad, and without being able to prevent these things will occur some but not others, so it is right to live a life based on justice, because sooner or later end up living all the acts that have occurred. In the events that happen to the universe will all have participated and facts are repeated and recycled indefinitely, because time is simply the path of a circle when you just start again, and the only immutable are universal truths located in the center of that circle representing God. In this universe also can all influence and if we act rightly be happy, so we must try to give meaning to our lives with prudent and critical attitude, considering the pursuit of truth as our main goal. Chapter 4, Toward a New Era. The Road to Health. In this confusing present time, people tend mistakenly think that health equals medicines, and that is a serious mistake. However, pharmaceutical companies is precisely what they want people to think in order to get rich. WHO, World Health Organization, is virtually folded their interests and is no more than a mere appendage and showcase of such companies that all they want is to consume more and more medicine to get rich. But in reality, most of the diseases do not need drugs to heal because they are caused by our bad lifestyle, and habits are those that must change for diseases disappear. Only time will tell how many thousands of people have died from the side effects of these medications was not necessary to take. It is not that drugs are bad in themselves. What is bad is to use them as a solution from the beginning. Actually, most of the diseases are caused by excessive intake of calories, so the solution is not medicate but to reduce and adjust the calories consumed. It is therefore desirable to limit the number of meals in an adult 4 daily, i.e. 2 alternating rhythmically small meals, i.e. each small meal would be followed by a large and vice versa food, so that between each meal not only consume anything calorie water. This is not only a good method of self, also serve as a measure of dental hygiene, as if after every meal we proceed to rinse and then drink water only teeth not suffer the pernicious caries. A good measure to combat obesity would have an essentially plant without excluding food and bread. This food as well as facilitating intestinal transit makes you feel full easily. It would also help without the car as long as this is possible. Some forget that the human body is a machine made to work. Introducing calories in the body and not spend it is very harmful to health. People have to learn to discover the pleasure of eat in moderation. It is also true that in some cases of obesity there is a genetic predisposition to suffer. This problem should be resolved by establishing a program to eradicate these defective genes by governments. There are animals that every day must eat the equivalent of their own body weight in order to live, and there are people all day eating or chewing as if they needed continuously feed. The truth is that human beings do not need a supply of food continuously, and become aware of it would be very positive for the dietary management, i.e. that the ideal is to classify the day into 2 main parts, a minority in which one feeds, and another majority in which it is assumed not to ingest anything but water. What is clear is that only the weight can be controlled adequately with a determination and willingly eat only at the set for it. So people who follow this method, it would be easier to forget about the food and eat less amount, being limited the number of meals they would take a day. There are also people who use food as a kind of stimulant, becoming as an addition, and would be wise to learn to separate things, because it is good the food is nice, but there are many things that we can entertain without resorting to overeating, so it is necessary simply to eat only the amount needed for food. Diet control is essential in human life, and responsible calorie consumption coupled with moderate exercise would increase life expectancy by as much as 30% on average. Those who think that eliminating sweet or salty foods from the diet is necessary to lose weight are also mistaken, since they forget the negative effect that anxiety can cause when using a diet that does not allow exceptions. A sweet from time to time can also help to combat the feeling of hunger. What good is a restrictive diet if the trauma and anxiety it causes force us to quit? Therefore, it can be said that the best diet is the one that allows exceptions, but that limits us to ingesting only the calories that are expended during the day. The key power is to be able to eat their fill without gaining weight. This will have to combine several factors. The first, moderate exercise, because without spending calories is hard not to get fat. the second consumed mostly low-calorie products, such as plant origin, but taking care not to abuse oils, and third to reduce the number of meals to 4. This means logically not eat anything between meals, which would be completely ruled out. In that period only water is consumed, thus it is more difficult fat, because the stomach size is limited and focus food intake to that small number of times fill the stomach easily, causing us through hunger and forcing us to stop eating. Find out how to enjoy food without gaining weight is a real pleasure and an art. Some also considered right that older people are obese. This is false, as obesity represents the surrender of balance to the deformity. In this age in which nature is no longer able to maintain an anatomy balanced by itself, it is necessary that people assume consciously the need to maintain caloric control and thus ensure that your life can be happy until the end. Be dominated by obesity is being dominated by disease and death. An elderly person is not a useless person, so it is necessary to stay fit to participate in social indefinite life. Perhaps these people have less physical strength than the young, but that does not mean that they stop being useful to society. Then they can always participate in companies as advisors or to train new employees. In addition, work 3 or 4 hours a day on a task that does not involve physical exertion can always be a good way to exercise both physically and mentally for them. Exclude persons over working life only leads to excessive overvaluation youth unfairly, because if it is true that young people can bring their vigor and physical strength, whereas older people can contribute their wisdom. Myths exposed. This section would stress the importance of ending some myths begin as unproven beliefs, but end up becoming accepted truths supposed to by doctors. First, let me demystify the belief that meat consumption is necessary for perfect health. Actually, it is only necessary and recommended consumption of vegetables, fruits, and vegetables. Proponents meat consumption argue that it is more nutritious and contain vitamin B12. Actually, plant foods can provide much protein, fat, or vitamins as necessary, and the reader should ask yourself if it is so necessary to eat meat to have health, as it is possible that many animals with a much poorer than our diet without eating any meat yet have perfect health. In addition, some studies suggest that vitamin D can be produced naturally by our own body. Mystify meat resulting is a society of obese given the large amount of fat that is usually. I believe that eventually meat will disappear from the human diet as plant foods will cover your same expectations. Another myth is the argument that it is necessary to expose the skin of our body naked in the sun. This belief began the habit of using brown skin tone as a symbol of ostentation and leisure. The reality is that the body takes that tone to protect themselves from harmful rays of the sun, and it is a real crime to health exposing bare skin to this radiation. It is not about being more or less time exposed, which is a mistake. It is to believe that should be done. The amount of vitamin D the body needs to synthesize the sun can be easily obtained through the face or arms. No further measures are necessary. We must bear in mind that the human body lost the layer of protective hair covering her because they began to wear clothing. Remove to expose bare skin to the sun is to reverse the trend. It is also unfortunate use of cosmetics, as most of them range from those that are useless and that are harmful to health. For example, advertise them saying they are needed for food or hydration of the skin is done but not said that feeds the skin and moisturizes naturally or through capillaries located beneath it. The human body is perfect in its essential nature, but these swindlers induce health needs in false people. The best favor we can do to our skin is keep it clean, and we only use degreasing soaps as necessary to clean the grease, because it is absurd that first we remove the natural oils using soaps and then we use creams to return these oils to where they were. Infections. In fact, bacteria and viruses do not have the original purpose cause disease because its true function is to decompose dead organic matter. The human body continually fights a fight with these beings, and good health helps not to cause damage. So some epidemics are typically caused by malnutrition, as a weak immune system has a low rejection of the action of bacteria allowing its extension. Sometimes infections arise when entering a living being in contact with a virus to which it is familiar, and therefore defensive reaction is slower. Sometimes overzealous for cleaning can also favor infections. For example, some forms of asthma might be caused to settle in the bronchi, some fungal spores favored by prolonged exposure to water vapor. Abusing air conditioning can also be very harmful to health. The right thing is to use it only if it is essential. therefore exposed to continuous changes of temperature detune the body and can cause the onset of colds and other diseases. In the future, as the world evolves and technology makes cities self-sufficient, mechanisms will be possible to isolate microorganisms and rid people of their harmful effects. This will be possible especially in the colonial worlds of space where no bacteria. Risk and health. Many people believe that the more risk you run with activity, more entertainment pleasure is obtained. This belief is a serious mistake because the risk and pleasure need not be related. This belief occurs mainly in people with immature personality, such as in the case of mountain climbers. This effort to climb mountains causing a risk to their lives totally unjustified, not have reason to be, but more unfortunate is that there are governments that finance it without caring the least. The foolish and unnecessary in such company, in life cannot be avoided. There is a certain degree of risk in activities undertaken, but seek danger deliberately is a mistake as well as a lack of respect for those who brought us into the world. Sexuality in Greece. During the years of splendor in Greece about 500 BC, philosophers began to consider the human figure as a work of art in itself regardless of the sex to which he belonged, i.e. recognized that the man was a beautiful being and blessed by nature. Later it was thought that if the man was beautiful, why not consider logical homosexual practice between people of the same sex? In my opinion, that was a distorted interpretation of reality, probably driven by any political leader or philosopher with that kind of sexual orientation. The truth is that both man and other living beings are works of art of nature, regardless of gender they belong to, because a work of art is all that is well done, but that does not mean it will be to derive a homosexual practice. It is true that the human figure is beautiful, but nature invented sex to practice with the opposite sex and makes no sense to give a different meaning. In the world there are many things and species that are beautiful, but that does not mean you have to relate to sex. For this reason it is particularly important to show a firm attitude of rejection of these practices, especially in teaching children. It is not the same respect freedom of choice to favor what is wrong. The battered women. Another example of the double standards of those politicians falsely called Democrats is their inability to be minimally to rise in cases of violence against women. Every year dozens of them are killed for the sole result of the sympathy of those politicians. Male abusers are actually addicted to mistreat, are people who have taken a negative life and take their wives by a kind of slave to which they think they can do whatever they want. In many cases these women are trapped by having children and are afraid to face them. This leads them to be even more scoundrels to the point of faking good behavior with the rest of society and saved the worst for his family. These men are bombs in power by adding it to abuse, and when separated from their victims feel great fury suddenly lacking the person that reflect their wickedness. Knowing the government that their lives are at risk for being threatened with death and restraining order, it is inexplicable that do not provide the means of defense. It would be easy to install signalers' bracelets whom the threat alert police if they approach them, or give them other means of self-defense. Breaking a restraining order should mean jail automatically, because it is not logical that the innocent who fear who threatens them are criminals who must fear the law. The abortion. The question that really matters in the abortion issue is not whether to allow or not, but rather whether the costs of such a practice must be paid by the state or by stakeholders. The reason is very simple, is that the state must protect life as an essential attitude. Therefore it is right that to respect the freedom of choice, not stand if someone wants an abortion, but as long as it is in the immediate aftermath of pregnancy, plus costs should be paid in full by stakeholders and not by the state. Ideally, from small children they were taught the importance of responsible sexuality, in order to prevent these events from occurring. Racism and miscegenation. After World War II, the issue of racial purity was relegated to the background, for those countries that had defeated Germany considered that they should oppose any ideology designed to preserve the values of their own race, believing that was which advocated the Nazis. From that moment, they appeared words like xenophobia in order to ridicule without addressing the reasons anyone who tried to defend ideas for the defense of racial integrity. I would note on this point that the Nazis were served the racial issue only as a pretext for the union of Austria with Germany, as Hitler thought Jews in Austria were not interested in such a union, as well as he will be glad when the armistice was signed peace in the First World War, which apparently annoyed him. Hitler made use of racial arguments in a frivolous manner in order to achieve their aims, in fact not even attending meetings organized society Thule, in favor of racial integrity. I would also like to stress that the issue of racial integrity was never a topic of discussion in the past. It was always considered tasteful to oppose any practice that would lead to the mixing of races, such as occurred in the America of the years 40, and that only after the Second World War it was thought that those who defended the racial integrity were the same as those who advocated the extermination or enslavement of other races. The truth is that they are two completely different issues, and that is why neo-Nazi groups are unable to progress. They do not understand that the fact considered correct defend their own racial or ideological values does not imply support slavery or abuse of other cultures as they did the Nazis. I would therefore like to make it clear that the defense of the values of culture and race need not be mixed with any attempt to enslave and mistreat others, and consider natural and right that all races coexist in peace and freedom, placing each in their respective territories and continents without mixing, because all races were created by nature for man to adapt to different climates from every continent. It is striking that when an ecologist talks about the defense of each animal species or each genetic variety within the same species, everyone considered acceptable and defendable, but when it comes to doing the same with the human species and preserve unmixed each of his races, people are shocked without realizing it's the same issue. The problem is that it tends to relate this to the last World War, but keep in mind that can defend their own cultural and racial values, which does not mean neglecting the others. Society must learn to value each issue separately and not fall into the mistake of oversimplifying things. As for the idea of racial superiority, in my opinion the right thing is that there are more evolved races than others, because the definition of superiority can be interpreted as a race have an advantage over the others, which does not have to be that way. Actually all races have almost the same qualities, such as intelligence, which itself marked differences in the aesthetic question is the cause of this is the climatic differences that exist on Earth. The human species had to adapt to them mainly in appearance, why those living in Africa adapted acquiring a dark complexion and features of the distended face, who lived in Asia were adapted by modifying their eyelids to keep them almost closed, acquiring a nervous personality. This was an inherited genetic adaptation that protected some of the extreme heat and other intense cold. The race could European call was the only one who acquired the ideal breeding values, because due to the existence there of a climate softer aesthetic features were not affected, and as a result a more beautiful race emerged. Therefore the most significant difference is that you can find beauty, but no longer important. In addition, it was nature in its wisdom that determined that each continent and climate correspond one race, and thus the human being does not have to alter this situation. Today society considers traumatic address this issue, but if one analyzes without prejudice or fear cannot deny that basically makes sense. Therefore, it is clear that the fact defend the racial integrity does not have to involve defending slavery nor that of any other form of mistreatment of other races, which seems to me entirely reprehensible. Also in the future, as they will colonize the solar system, installing colonies on different planets may also be made on racial criteria, and on the hottest planets like Mercury and Venus could set the black and Arabic, planets Central Mars, Jupiter and Saturn the white race, and the planets Uranus, Neptune and Pluto the yellow race. In the same way that progress of the cosmos was based on the progress of chaos to order, the progress of human beings should be directed towards the defense of their own race, opposing disorder involving any form of interbreeding, but also opposing any form of slavery. Because the true meaning of humanism much talked about after the Second World War is that all races should live together with mutual respect and harmony, but that does not mean it will have to derive miscegenation. How can you consider it right to allow immigration and mingling with people from countries whose technological level is typical of the Stone Age? That can only be understood as an attempt to use these people as slaves covertly, but at the cost of destroying the social order. If really what they want is the good of these people, why they do not helping their home countries instead of constantly interfering in its internal affairs? Always better every citizen lives with those like him, not as a racial minority in other countries, and being discriminated against while you say that does not exist. In my opinion, eventually all races evolve to end up being equal, as climate control determining a temperature equal in all cities will no longer exist. Factors that hinder this development is once achieved, though as it arrives so naturally every man and every nation has the duty to prevent the loss of their own cultural and racial heritage and territories and independence which corresponds to each race. The pro-miscegenation countries. When just the Second World War, the United States was as great world power successor in history, the power of Rome during its development than usual was still maintain the traditional separation between races, which had always considered tasteful, but it had one drawback, is that if it was accepted or consented to, the presence and coexistence permanently from people of different races in the same territory could lead to a situation of social injustice. The problem was that on one hand the government wanted to keep blacks separate from whites for practical purposes, but at the same time coexist with them in the same cities and territories to use their work. This in my view is a despicable practice. Slavery and the caste system like India, this was the cause of the liberation movements for racial carry out their protests. Those who fought for these rights as Martin Luther King or Lyndon B. Johnson only got a bitter victory, for equal legal rights of all citizens only solved the problem halfway. The only way to recognize these rights completely would be by giving land to each of the races in proportion to its population in order to create an independent state for each of them. Instead, the confrontation between citizens will be encouraged, allowing easy access to weapons. But the frivolity of some governments like the US and France is striking, as promulgated publicly rejecting discriminatory measures but also use this as a pretext to be seen in the right to invade any country in the world and integrate his government. See but the example of the invasion of Algeria by the French and Iraq by the Americans to seize oil and impose their favorable to their interests and businesses government, but the result of a shattered country and 1 million civilian casualties as a result. This means that on the one hand pretends racial unity and other countries invade other races. This is an act of supreme hypocrisy, and the Romans did before with disastrous results. The right thing would be that each race should be limited to consider lawful political expansion only within their racial area, i.e. be formed on earth 4 zones, one who belongs to the white race, especially in the area of Europe, North America and Australia, one for blacks mainly in Africa, one for the Arab race in North Africa, Central America, Middle East and India, and another for the yellow race in Asia. As a result, the races would regroup so that, for example, in the United States would need to create new nations by dividing its territory. The native Indians, they could deliver the reserves so they could build their own states, and blacks would give another territory such as Florida or half the warmer southern territories. So each race would have their governance systems differentially and would be prohibited by international treaties interference of some races in the affairs of others. And the headquarters of the United Nations would be rotating and have one on every continent and racial district of so that change of place approximately every 5 years, plus the discriminatory veto right which was introduced after World War so that the majority vote would be abandoned. As it regards the control of nuclear weapons, no longer be considered legitimate, for countries that possess these weapons are created on the right to invade those countries wishing to have them to stop them. Because the logical and fair would create international laws establishing in the same circumstances all countries that comply can access them without coercion, because after the Second World War more than control the proliferation of these weapons, what was done was create a monopoly of them by the victorious countries that war, which was used as an excuse for the invasion of Iraq and the imposition of sanctions on Iran. However, the United States were quick to provide these arms to its allies France, Britain, or Israel. Could it be that the people of these countries, they must be considered persons entitled to live, but the Arabs? Using 2 yardsticks is impossible to bring peace, because in the end what is decided here is who holds the world supremacy, and clearly who possesses nuclear weapons has advantage over one who does not have any political negotiation. Not bad. Try to avoid excessive proliferation of nuclear weapons. What is wrong is to use a discriminatory and arbitrary policy in deciding which countries can possess these weapons and what not. The beast of the sea. And the sea saw up a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads names of blasphemy. The beast I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion, and the dragon passed his power and his throne and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if he had been killed, but he was healed of its mortal blow, and all the world wondered, and went after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? And who can make war? And he was given a mouth speaking haughtiness and blasphemies, and it was given authority to do his work for 42 months. He opened his mouth for blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, and his dwelling and those who dwell in heaven. He was also allowed to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. And they worshipped the dragon, all the inhabitants of the earth whose names are not written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the slain Lamb. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity, he will go into captivity. If anyone has to die by the sword, will die by the sword. Herein is the patience and faith of the saints. Revelation 13. The Roman Empire was in many ways a progressive empire that gave great impetus to the development of science. That legacy is still much today, but Rome was not able to understand that the rising strength of European nations like Greece or Macedonia or herself was not the result of chance, because in the world was brewing a major climate change, was spinning circles of world power in Africa and the Middle East to Europe. The gradual increase in global temperature after the end of the last ice was thawing large areas of the continent and stimulating life there. These people had for centuries been dormant for the rawness of the bitter cold, but with the removal of the ice marked the beginning of civilization. Greece experienced a large increase in their vitality, and from that moment everything seemed easier, life was more pleasant and crops grew more abundant. Climate improves not only gave impetus to the development of science and philosophy, as well as experienced significant population growth, which explains his great desire colonizer. European civilization was born and its inhabitants were optimistic. Meanwhile, the countries that were the cradle of the Mesopotamian civilization and Egypt they was going the opposite, were to desert marches accelerated by moving the center of world power northward. Rome was not able to understand that their future was in their policy in Europe rather than in Africa or Asia expansion. They thought that if they were part of ancient civilizations to modern would be better, but what resulted was that his empire remained weighed down by bringing together an empire in decline with another expanding. Another senseless act was to move the capital to Constantinople. That was like reverse the natural order of things, because instead of betting on the future by installing the capital in Central Europe, decided last when installed in a southern country. Rome as Babylon fell into the temptation of promoting slavery and miscegenation, and did not realize it was their cultural and racial harmony principle which made it great, did not understand that a mestizo society based on slavery can never be a strong and cohesive society. A slave can never fight citizens or feel like other people. Currently the United States forget that originally was a racially homogeneous society and was in this context as it became a great nation, but in their quest for world domination are consenting miscegenation of their society, which also is a disguised form of slavery, because that illegal immigration once crossing the border is tolerated and becomes cheap labor for exploitation by the company's work, because it gives more importance to that social economics without giving no value to the culture. United States and other countries supporting miscegenation are growing at the expense of selling and give up their race, culture, and internal cohesion, creating in citizens a growing dissatisfaction of not knowing where they are feeling and what culture they belong, and all the mere profiteering by businesses. Social peace is sacrificed for economic profit of some, but corroding the roots of their own society. In addition, the United States is promoting racial miscegenation as an excuse to invade the territories of other races, and that's really vile. Political or economic growth of a country cannot be done without respecting basic principles of justice and social ethics, because eventually end up destroying the very roots of society. You see, as an example, the history of Sparta, were great because he always preserved his sense of race and nation, but sank to enslaving hypocritically helots. Slavery is always reprehensible, but when it comes to enslave their own countrymen is even more incomprehensible. Another example was the Kingdom of Castile. During the reconquest of Spain from the Muslims was a society of race and homogeneous culture, and it made her strong and confident, but after the union of the peninsula and the conquest of America downgraded its principles racial, what led her to lose direction, no longer know where to go. The United States propaganda being more Democrats than anyone, but do not hesitate to negotiate with dictators like Franco or Pinochet in order to get their purposes. They claim to seek peace in the world, but during World War II refused to negotiate peace with Japan and demanded the unconditional surrender in order to launch its atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so on the one hand to show the world that they were the new masters, and the other test the effects of radiation on civilians. Claimed to reject chemical weapons, but sprayed Vietnam with thousands of tons of these weapons, causing serious consequences among the peasants, who still remain. The end cannot justify the means. It is true that communism is a reprehensible ideology that strangles economic growth by preventing private sector companies as well as showing little interest in democracy, but the extremist capitalism practiced in the West also is a capitalism that fosters class society and contempt for the poor. Both superpowers Russia and the United States criticize each other, but their interest is the same: world domination. Throughout history, great powers have always found an excuse to justify their imperialist campaigns to Rome, simply trying to defend their republic which they considered superior, and the United States all boiled down to fight communism, and when the Soviet Union disappeared suddenly became his enemy terrorism, but never take any responsibility for their own actions. This is not to say that Americans do not have good, just as there were in Rome, for each of these two nations have represented the vanguard of progress in his time things, and these criticisms do not pursue their detriment but their change. The United States now represent the resurgence of Rome, whose head was cut off by history and is destined to suffer the same consequences. It should consider that society is first and business profit later. Nations, like people, can be punished by nature when they deviate from the right path. The keys to progress. They might compare the keys to progress with the various links of a chain forming a circle. Each link is an idea or scientific discovery that has a common denominator together with the rest. When these links connect, its binding produces a multiplier effect and causes the evolutionary leap, when the world is experiencing, which often suddenly, starts from the time a slow process of preparing a new great leap to a higher level, i.e. on one hand the evolution occurs slowly, but at the same time occurs quickly, is the accumulation of stresses in the Earth's crust before an earthquake. The forces that prepare you act all the time slowly, but the earthquake unleashed these forces quickly, i.e. you could say that the preparation of an evolutionary leap, slow, runs a horizontal path, and makes sudden leaps vertically and fast. To be able to give an evolutionary leap needed those key findings preparing the biggest jump, which is not otherwise made, to the effect of gathering together all those discoveries that have elements in common. The planet Earth is now approaching that critical point where humanity gets to stop being a world backward and finally understand the truths that make the free, and the world finally finds peace. The purpose of this book is to convey to readers what in my view are those links that the world needs to complete its evolution. Who bother to carefully analyze these ideas and be able to understand you can view things differently, and no longer need further explanation, as there will be understood the truth. Then I will summarizes what are the keys that I think the world needs to take that evolutionary leap. Birth control. It is absolutely essential that any company wishing to have an internal order in which all resources reach for all, establish a system of birth control for all couples, have limited the number of children to, except in exceptional cases. Thus governments can establish policies to ensure employment without which no project is possible. In ancient times often epidemics decimated the population, dying soon thousands of people. They wondered what was the cause of their misfortunes and blaming God, wondering why this punishment is cruel. However, the responsibility of human misfortunes are generally a result of their own reckless behavior. In the case of epidemics, birth control would have prevented food was scarce, and a hungry population is certainly the right way for a virus to thrive. At present there are countries such as India where the main problem of the human being is the human being, that is, the uncontrolled growth of its population makes the quality of life leaves much to be desired. Democracy is necessary for society to establish a democratic system in all governments of the earth, a system by which each and every one of the laws to be elected directly by citizens, not as in now there are only apparent democracies. To say that would be difficult to implement does not make sense, because you can get through means such as the internet. Some say that most citizens do not have enough to direct the power culture, but this is not a matter of knowledge but freedom, freedom that every citizen should have to decide their own future. Besides, politicians could always advise citizens in what they deemed appropriate. A system of direct vote of each law does not have to override the parliament, because it would be logical laws passed in it can only be repealed by a majority of more than 50% of the electorate, so those who agreed with the approved laws would only have to let go. With this system no longer exist political privileges as the monarchy, and all citizens could access any charge alike. Justice. Society needs to respect arises for others as an essential rule of coexistence, and this is taught in schools. It is also necessary that governments are strong to crimes, meaning that when a crime is severe, sentence also is, and who commits a crime with malice aforethought lose the right to decide about their life staying in prison for the rest of her fair pay, because the devil you do not negotiate the demon is destroyed. All wavering attitude encourages these criminals use it to groan. No offense should be silent in response. The state, as in the false democracies, it is very common in them that a criminal add hundreds of complaints before any action is taken to fix it. It is also right to demand that prisoners work in order to give back to society caused by the costs incurred. Some say that society has a share of responsibility in the crime, but even if that were true does not justify why criminals are left without punishment. Every crime must have been a fair response that serves to not repeat, not passive and complicit attitude given many times. It is also regrettable that there are governments in the world that are dedicated to creating laws to allow thieves leave prison after serving only a minimum penalty for crimes committed without having obligation to return the stolen items, even for large sums of money. Undoubtedly, when they create these antisocial laws, who think it is primarily benefit themselves in case of arrest for corruption. Moral. It is necessary to accept that the spiritual life is eternal, and life is just a cyclical process by which the spirit is reincarnated successively in the body. Because only the body is weak and mortal, the spirit is strong and immortal. In addition, any advanced society must consider the moral training as essential, in order to progress, therefore should be a key subject in schools, but free from the influence of sects and religious organizations. It would be best that is organized by the Ministry of Education and parents of students. Respect for racial zones. It is necessary that each race is limited to be in the continents and racial areas as assigned, therefore no government would be entitled to expand its territory outside the area that corresponds. Logically, this would not stop making trips or business activities. In the world there would be 4 of these areas, one for each race, and be coordinated together by the government of the United Nations, which would be rotating between them. Family peace. It is necessary that each sex assume its role and responsibility to avoid competing with each other, for man and woman were made by nature to be complementary to each other and not to maintain a permanent rivalry. Thus women as a general rule have part-time jobs that allow them to deal with the important task of birth and generational renewal. This need not prevent a woman can work on what you like, but be realistic, and if a woman has children the recommended age, which is still young, he would hardly be possible to devote himself to other activities. I do not mean by this that everything that represents feminism is evil, but it is naive to think that all that is good or bad is summed with easy words like racism or feminism, as in what is associated with them may be things completely correct but also other completely wrong, and many times these words are used to not accept this reality. Rejection. Drugs, including snuff or alcohol, should be rejected, since all they do is violate the mechanisms of our brain stimulation unnaturally, well as causing a disturbance in the judgment. However, this does not mean they should be prohibited, since the fact that something is immoral or harmful to health does not mean that the state has to prevent the right of citizens to choose freely about it. Politicians should refuse to play God and simply create laws so that citizens can live with all due mutual respect towards each other, but without falling into the trap of trying to decide in an arbitrary manner that is lawful citizens do and what is not. However, the state can and you must refuse to apply any extenuating those who commit crimes while under the influence of such substances. Social rights. Governments need to ensure all its citizens' basic rights such as the right to employment, health, or property, without which no choice is possible. This does not mean that such services have to be public, it is rather to ensure that due to a situation of economic hardship or other citizens are never disadvantaged. It is also important that the state create the necessary conditions so that young people can easily become independent and begin properly their adult lives. Guarantee employment or favor renting public housing would help a lot to it. In fact, ideally the state would guarantee rental housing for all citizens. Progress is in the balance. The key in most situations is to maintain a moderate or intermediate attitude, that is in an equilibrium position, under the circumstances. For example, it is not better overeating nor failing, excessive optimism nor depression, so bad is excessive cold and excessive heat, overwork as failing, as with these examples could consider for just about everything. However, I do not mean by this that a moderate or intermediate attitude is always the solution to problems, because everything has its exceptions, and when a problem is serious the solution also has to be. Moderation is a generic solution, but if for some reason something goes out of its proper place so important, then how to restore balance should also be energetic and forceful, i.e. in this case the strength leads to equilibrium. And moral equilibrium. One of the characteristics of the evolved worlds is that in this society and there is no coincidence in the same time and place of honest and unbalanced as it exists now people. Indeed, ignorance is in a very broad cause of this situation sense, therefore, when humanity assume the importance of eradicating despotic and selfish behavior will achieve great harmony and have peace. When I say cause I do not mean necessarily health imbalances but imbalances in moral behavior caused by ignorance on how to find the best way to live. No society can be considered evolved if not facing the remedy imbalances both in regard to the eradication of genetic as to the moral formation of its citizens' diseases. Arrogance and vanity are undoubtedly the greatest enemies to defeat in this world, therefore, in the future, humanity and not violence or war as a way of getting things pose, because it is through peaceful coexistence, science, and technology as happiness is achieved. Epilogue. When I decided to write this book, I wanted was to provide readers with a guide to know the keys to my mind missing the modern man to get to achieve full self-realization in the cosmos, some keys that help you understand the truth and that truth makes you free and happy. I do not intend to limit myself to condescend to the topics of the era in which it was written, because my goal is to tell the truth, even if it means me rejecting who is unable to deviate from the guidelines that the beast will mark, i.e. the ideological direction that the great powers and those who manage to impose in an indirect way. Unfortunately, the current man gives more importance to what is considered true than what is true, is partly for fear of contradicting the politically established truths, but also the limited time available to reflect on the world around him. However, many prefer to accept prefabricated truths that the powers propose them in order not to have to think, but in this case these people should not comment on anything, because what sense then have their conclusions? In fact, those organizations that handle the current power are like governments or religious organizations fear the citizens, because the direction of progress asks for more democracy, but they do not want to provide it because they feel comfortable with the undercover feudalism exists in today. It is the cause of it increasingly larger the difference between what seems true and what is true. Religious organizations have fallen prey to evil because they sense that their fate is to disappear and be replaced by moral education in schools, thus becoming resist evil because they want to control the world political power to which they are not entitled. Meanwhile, governments misnamed democratic, devote all their efforts to convince citizens that they represent democracy, but put all possible obstacles to get that democracy is truly authentic, because it would have to accept the direct election of each law, which would involve the loss of power. They try to stay distant from the citizens who vote them and whom they despise because they considered mere numbers you do not mind trick to get the power, and in many cases coalesce with criminals because they establish absurd sentences or clauses which the end worst crimes are virtually unpunished, all with the intention that they should be convicted of any crime can be free in the shortest time possible. Citizens need to wake up and say to those Democrats false politicians who have discovered them and no longer be worth them his tricks to deceive them and get their vote, and from now on every one of the laws should be chosen directly by citizens. That ridiculous game between left and right that only serves to alternately power but back to society dealt ran out. Because Satan knows that he has little time and try to prevent the man to know the truth and what is the true meaning of God, because God is the light and the truth and the devil's just evil that lurks behind ignorance. But humanity is beginning to understand that only through a critical attitude is discovered the difference between what is true and what is not. Only when we seek God for ourselves without accepting the impositions of intermediaries we can know the truth that it makes you free. It is not impossible that in the future there may be a perfect world. It is only necessary that governments society arise as a unified whole and set policies accordingly, for it is necessary to begin by establishing a number of inhabitants per country and fixed city through a birth control to limit the number of children to 2 per couple, so that economic resources reach for everyone. It is also necessary that the means are in place to enable young people to emancipate soon as the job guarantee or provide housing as a state holiday. If the government raises society as a unit in which all have certainly will get. It is necessary that people stop following the guidelines that marks the beast out of the sea that is the United States. It is necessary to reject its slave-holding policy and pro-miscegenation that wants to impose and demand that he return to his roots in the dignity it was a value of paramount importance to mankind finally reaches a new era of peace and prosperity. You need to create a more spiritual world where decent people no longer have to worry about criminals, a world in which people are first and then business interests. My dream to do this book is not the reader to believe me but you understand me. You need to make the effort to analyze things without prejudices of the times, without following the guidelines that the great powers make that break those chains that fear causes established power to reach the goal of a free thinking. Hopefully hasten the day when humanity understand the truth, and then the earth will be like a bride adorned for her union with God, and then God will descend to earth. I illuminate the world with its light and demons can no longer deceive more people and then there will be peace and happiness forever. Finish.